41 minutes. Not 4 minutes. Not 14 minutes. 41 minutes of documented, timestamped presence inside the home of an 84-year-old woman living in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. That number is the number that changed everything about this investigation from the inside, long before the public knew a single thing. It is the number that made Sheriff Chris Nanos pick up his phone and make a call that sheriffs almost never make in missing person cases. It is the number that separated what law enforcement was being told about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance from what the evidence was actually showing them. And it is the number that, when you truly understand what it means, when you understand what experienced investigators know about human behavior and criminal timing inside residential properties, makes the kidnapping narrative collapse entirely. This is not a story about who took Nancy Guthrie. The investigation remains active as of February 14, 2026, and law enforcement has not publicly identified a suspect. 3 individuals were detained on the evening of February 13 near a neighborhood approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home, following FBI and SWAT operations involving multiple agencies. But this story is about something more fundamental than who. It is about why Sheriff Nanos knew, from the very beginning, that what happened inside Nancy Guthrie's home was something profoundly different from what the ransom notes were telling everyone. It is about 41 minutes. It is about essential medication left sitting on a kitchen counter. It is about security cameras that failed in ways that suggest prior knowledge. It is about ransom communications that violated every behavioral pattern of professional abduction for financial gain. And it is about DNA found at the property that does not belong to Nancy or anyone close to her. Before we examine every piece of evidence in this case and what it tells investigators about what actually happened, understand this. We do not speculate. We examine documented evidence, confirmed official statements, and the investigative patterns that experienced law enforcement recognizes, even when the public has not yet caught up with what the evidence is showing. If you think this case is exactly what the ransom notes want you to believe it is, hear everything first. Then decide. Now let us start where the investigation actually started. Not with the ransom notes. With 41 minutes. Before any analysis, any theory, any evidence breakdown, we need to understand who this investigation is truly about. Because the moment Nancy Guthrie becomes an abstraction, the moment she becomes a case number or a media headline rather than a living, breathing person, we lose the most important thing about this entire investigation. Nancy Long Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942, in Fort Worth, Kentucky. She is 84 years old. She raised 3 children in Arizona over more than 5 decades. Annie, Savannah, Cameron. She became a grandmother. She remained mentally sharp, cognitively clear, and deeply engaged with the world around her well into her 80s. Her daughter Savannah described her in a video released on February 13 in terms that reveal a woman whose presence is felt immediately by everyone who knows her. "Our mom is a kind, faithful, loyal, fiercely loving woman of goodness and light," Savannah said. "She has grandchildren that adore her and crowd around her and cover her with kisses." That woman. That grandmother. She was taken from her home sometime in the pre-dawn hours of February 1, 2026. And the manner in which she was taken, the evidence left behind, the evidence not left behind, and the evidence that should not have been there at all forms the investigative foundation of everything that follows. Sheriff Chris Nanos described Nancy to reporters as sharp as a tack. She had no cognitive impairment. No dementia. No conditions that would cause confusion or disorientation. She was physically limited, with mobility concerns that law enforcement acknowledged publicly. She required daily medication for serious health conditions, including management related to a pacemaker. But her mind was clear. She knew exactly what was happening the night someone entered her home. That clarity matters enormously to everything that comes next. Because what happened to Nancy Guthrie was not the random targeting of a vulnerable elderly woman by criminals who stumbled upon an opportunity. What happened required detailed knowledge. Specific knowledge. The kind of knowledge that comes from proximity, not distance. Nancy lived independently in her home in the Catalina foothills. She maintained her routines. She stayed connected with her family. She managed her health with the discipline that 84 years of living teaches a person. She was someone's mother. Someone's grandmother. Someone who mattered deeply to the people who loved her. And on February 1, 2026, someone who knew far too much about her life walked into her home and changed everything. February 1, 2026. Pre-dawn hours. Tucson, Arizona. Nancy Guthrie vanished from her home in the Catalina foothills, one of the most established and quiet residential areas in the region. The kind of neighborhood where people know their neighbors, where unusual activity gets noticed, where an 84-year-old woman should have been completely safe. But she was not safe. When family members realized Nancy was missing, law enforcement responded immediately. This was not treated as a standard missing person case from the outset, and there is a precise reason for that. The circumstances were wrong from the very beginning. Sheriff Chris Nanos did not delegate this case to a detective and wait for updates. He arrived at the scene himself. He walked through Nancy's home. He reviewed what investigators were finding in real time. And within hours, he made a decision that would set the entire trajectory of this investigation. But before we get to that decision, you need to understand the timing of Nancy's disappearance, because timing, as you will see repeated across every dimension of this case, is everything. The exact weekend Nancy disappeared, her daughter Savannah Guthrie, co-anchor of NBC's Today Show, was scheduled to travel internationally for the network's coverage of the 2026 Winter Olympics. This was not a last-minute assignment. Olympic coverage assignments are determined weeks, sometimes months, in advance through complex network planning that involves production teams, travel arrangements, broadcasting logistics, and international credential processes. Savannah's assignment would have been known to her professional circle, her social contacts, and by extension, anyone within the broader network of people who interacted with the Guthrie family in personal or professional capacities. Consider what that timing means. Nancy would potentially be alone for extended periods. Immediate family response to any emergency would be complicated by Savannah being located internationally, consumed by a major live broadcast commitment. The primary family member most likely to mobilize quickly and decisively in a crisis would be physically distant and professionally occupied at the precise moment she was most needed. The precision of this timing, landing on the exact weekend of Savannah's scheduled departure, is extraordinarily difficult to attribute to coincidence. Coincidences in criminal cases do exist. But coincidences that align perfectly with the specific vulnerability windows created by private scheduling decisions of close family members deserve intense scrutiny. This coordination suggests access to information about family schedules, professional obligations, and personal commitments that extends well beyond what public media coverage would provide. Savannah's Olympic assignment may have been known publicly. But the specific weekend of departure, the specific window of maximum vulnerability, the specific period when her ability to respond quickly would be most compromised, that level of detail is not public information. It is the kind of information that circulates within the social, professional, and service circles that intersect with a family's daily life. Contractors who worked on the home. Service providers who made regular visits. Social contacts who were present frequently enough to hear fragments of family planning through casual conversation. Law enforcement began their neighborhood canvass immediately. They started reviewing security footage from surrounding properties. They began constructing the timeline. And that is when the first piece of truly disturbing evidence emerged. The number that would change everything. 41 minutes. The number lives in the digital record. 41 minutes of documented presence inside Nancy Guthrie's home, established through digital timestamps and electronic evidence reviewed during the investigation. To understand why that number matters so profoundly, you need to understand what experienced law enforcement knows about criminal behavior during residential intrusions. Not what criminals claim about it afterward. What the behavioral record of thousands of cases actually demonstrates. Time is the absolute enemy of criminal success inside a residence. Every additional minute spent inside a target location exponentially increases the risk of discovery, increases the probability of witness identification, increases the chance of something unexpected happening that forces an improvised response. This is not theory. This is documented behavioral reality that former homicide detective Ted Williams described in public media appearances with the authority of decades investigating violent crime. Professional criminals understand this intuitively. They build their entire operations around minimizing time inside target locations. Professional burglars operate with what specialists describe as militaristic precision. Entry. Target acquisition. Exit. The documented average operational duration for experienced property criminals is approximately 5 minutes. That is the benchmark established by behavioral research across thousands of residential crimes. 5 minutes. In. Target secured or acquired. Out. 10 minutes suggests either inexperience or prior knowledge of a high-value specific target that justifies extended search time. 15 minutes indicates serious risk tolerance or desperation that experienced criminals actively avoid. 20 minutes inside a residence begins to approach the behavioral territory associated with something beyond property crime, something personal, something that requires time because the objective itself demands it. 30 minutes suggests a comfort level that originates from only one of two sources. Either detailed advanced knowledge of the location and its patterns, or a complete disregard for consequences that emerges from a specific type of psychological profile. 41 minutes is something categorically different. 41 minutes of confident, documented presence represents operational familiarity that strangers simply cannot possess through brief observation or casual surveillance. It represents comfort with the interior layout, comfort with the security systems, or with the precise absence of functioning security systems, comfort with the routines and patterns of whoever lives there. The kind of comfort that comes from insider knowledge, or from extensive and dedicated prior surveillance of the kind that professional criminal operations invest in only when the target justifies substantial resource commitment. Former homicide detective Williams stated this conclusion directly. 41 minutes inside a residence indicates that the individuals involved possessed detailed knowledge of the property. They understood its layout. They felt comfortable with the security situation. They operated with a confidence that should not exist among strangers encountering a residential target for the first time. That assessment carries the weight of decades of behavioral observation across hundreds of violent crime investigations. Think about what that means specifically for this case. Someone spent 41 minutes in the home of an 84-year-old woman with limited mobility, in the complete darkness of pre-dawn hours, without triggering any response that would have forced early departure, without creating any commotion that reached neighbors, with enough time and enough composure to conduct whatever their presence required. That is not the behavior of a stranger who identified Nancy Guthrie as an opportunistic target. That is the behavior of someone who knew this home, who had been there before, in some capacity, under some circumstances, who understood exactly what to do and precisely how much time they had to do it. Sheriff Nanos was briefed on this timeline and this evidence pattern within the first 24 hours of the investigation. And the moment he understood what 41 minutes meant in the context of everything else found at that scene, he made his decision. But it was not just the duration of presence that alarmed him. It was what was left behind. Nancy Guthrie's essential medications remained in her home after whoever took her spent 41 minutes inside it. Not hidden. Not locked away. Accessible. Visible on the kitchen counter where she kept them for easy morning access. The sheriff was specific in his public statements about the nature of these medications. These were not lifestyle supplements. Not optional wellness products. These were pharmaceuticals managing serious medical conditions whose absence creates rapid physiological deterioration. The specific conditions were not disclosed publicly to protect family privacy, but the medical necessity was unambiguous. These medications maintained Nancy's physiological stability, prevented dangerous complications, and kept her alive and functional. Missing a single day of treatment for conditions of this severity can trigger serious medical episodes. Missing multiple days creates cascading health crises that threaten survival regardless of any other circumstance. Now consider what professional kidnapping for financial gain actually requires. Not as theory, but as documented operational necessity established through decades of criminal cases investigated by law enforcement around the world. Victims must be kept alive, reasonably healthy, and manageable until ransom collection is complete. Dead victims cannot be exchanged for money. Critically ill victims become operational liabilities rather than assets. They require emergency medical intervention that creates exposure. They become unpredictable. They complicate negotiation timelines. They force decisions that experienced kidnappers plan meticulously to avoid. Essential medication keeps victims stable. It prevents the medical emergencies that could force premature contact with hospitals or emergency services. It maintains the operational timeline that ransom negotiation requires. Any professional kidnapping operation, any operation genuinely motivated by financial extraction from the Guthrie family, would have taken those medications. Not as an afterthought. As basic operational necessity. They were not taken. This forces an uncomfortable analytical conclusion. Either whoever spent 41 minutes in Nancy's home did not understand the medical necessity of those medications despite spending enough time there to see them clearly and conduct whatever else they were doing, or they understood the medical necessity and the medications were left behind deliberately. The first possibility requires explaining how someone with enough insider knowledge to spend 41 comfortable minutes in the residence failed to understand a basic aspect of the person they were supposedly taking for ransom. The second possibility points towards something investigators consider with extreme care. An operation that did not include keeping Nancy alive long enough for ransom collection to matter. Nancy Guthrie's residence was equipped with what the investigative record describes as a professional-grade security installation. Multiple cameras positioned to provide comprehensive coverage of key areas around the property perimeter. A Google Nest doorbell camera on the front porch. Additional cameras at interior locations. During the 41-minute window when someone was present in her home, the interior cameras were not functioning. Not broken by mechanical failure. Not disabled by a power surge or random equipment malfunction. They were inoperable in a manner that suggested deliberate intervention, or, critically, advanced knowledge of which specific systems needed to be addressed. The doorbell camera disconnected at 1:47 a.m., the precise timestamp Sheriff Nanos presented in his February 5th press conference. Not because it malfunctioned. Because someone disconnected it, as recovered surveillance footage would later demonstrate. Professional security systems include redundancies specifically designed to prevent this type of selective, targeted failure. Backup power supplies. Tamper alerts. Multiple overlapping camera angles. These redundancies exist precisely because security companies understand that criminals will attempt to disable surveillance. The systems are built to make complete disabling extremely difficult without detailed knowledge of the specific installation. The pattern of camera failure at Nancy's home indicated something investigators recognized immediately. This level of security system awareness indicates familiarity that cannot be achieved through casual observation from the street. Someone had to know specifically which equipment needed to be addressed. The camera placement. The equipment specifications. Where the connections were located. How the system operated. That knowledge comes from one of two sources. Direct personal experience inside the residence, or detailed information provided by someone who possessed that personal experience. Detective Williams addressed this specific aspect in his public analysis. Security system knowledge of this specificity indicates prior legitimate presence on the property. He assessed the likely sources as contractors who worked on installation or maintenance, service providers with regular interior access, or social contacts who had been inside frequently enough to understand the layout and the systems in detail. Each of those categories points not toward strangers, but toward people who had stood inside that home with Nancy's knowledge and trust. We have already discussed how Nancy's disappearance occurred on the exact weekend Savannah was scheduled to travel internationally. But this detail deserves re-emphasis because of what it reveals about the depth of insider knowledge required. Random criminals do not plan around the specific travel schedules of a victim's prominent family member. Random criminals do not spend 41 comfortable minutes inside a residence. Random criminals do not know which interior cameras to disable and precisely where those connections are located. The picture forming from the physical evidence was not consistent with stranger crime. The picture forming was consistent with something else entirely. Something that Sheriff Nanos recognized with enough clarity to make the call that changed the entire trajectory of this investigation. Against everything the evidence inside Nancy's home was telling investigators, the ransom communications arrived. And investigators who have spent careers studying professional kidnapping operations recognized something immediately when they reviewed what was being sent. These communications did not fit the behavioral pattern of real abduction for financial gain. Not in small ways. In fundamental ways that experienced investigators who have studied professional ransom operations across decades recognize as categorical departures from how these crimes actually work. Professional kidnapping for financial gain follows consistent operational patterns that have remained remarkably stable across different criminal organizations, geographic regions, and decades of law enforcement investigation. These patterns are not arbitrary stylistic preferences. They are operational necessities reflecting the logical requirements of successfully extracting money from a family while managing law enforcement pressure. Communication must be consistent. Frequent enough to maintain family urgency and compliance. Structured enough to move systematically toward collection. Specific enough to provide a clear payment pathway. Proof of life is not optional in this framework. It is the fundamental transaction of legitimate ransom negotiation. The family provides money. The criminals provide the victim. For that transaction to proceed, the family must have ongoing evidence that the victim is alive and that payment will result in her return. Without credible, verifiable, regular proof of life, a family's willingness to pay deteriorates rapidly. Experienced kidnappers provide proof of life because their entire operation depends on it. Deadlines serve specific purposes in professional ransom operations. They create payment urgency. They compress the decision timeline in ways that make rational resistance more difficult. But they are not meant to pass without consequence. Deadlines that expire without follow-through or meaningful rescheduling communicate operational weakness and reduce family compliance with future demands. The Nancy Guthrie ransom communications violated all of these patterns from the beginning. Multiple deadlines passed without credible follow-through or sustained negotiation pressure. A $6 million Bitcoin demand arrived with a 5 p.m. Thursday deadline, followed by a second deadline for the following Monday. Both passed without the consequences or the sustained engagement that professional kidnapping operations maintain with disciplined consistency. Communication became erratic rather than systematic, inconsistent rather than structured. The family received messages, then silence, then messages from sources whose authenticity could not be verified. Most critically, no acceptable proof of life was provided. No specific details about Nancy's current condition that could be independently verified. No location markers confirming her status. No personal information that only Nancy herself could provide to demonstrate ongoing direct access to her. The most basic currency of legitimate ransom negotiation was entirely absent. FBI Special Agent in charge of the Phoenix office, Heath Jane, addressed the ransom question in public statements. Whether to pay any ransom, he said, is ultimately the family's decision, consistent with the FBI's advisory position on such matters. But the absence of verifiable proof of life left the family and investigators without the fundamental evidence that legitimate ransom negotiations produce as their opening transaction. Former FBI Special Agent Catherine Schweit, who investigated a strikingly comparable case in rural Wisconsin in 2003, made this point with striking directness in her interview with NBC News. In that Wisconsin case, an 88-year-old grandmother was abducted by her granddaughter's boyfriend for ransom. The criminal communicated aggressively and consistently from the beginning because successful financial extraction was genuinely his goal. If you were going to abduct somebody for cash, Schweit asked, why wouldn't you aggressively try to get the cash by communicating with the family right from the start so you could get your money and return the victim? The question answers itself. The absence of consistent, aggressive, proof-of-life-backed communication in the Nancy Guthrie case tells investigators something fundamental about whether financial extraction is actually the operational objective. Then Derek Kalila happened. On February 4, 2026, Annie Guthrie and her husband received a text message from an unknown number. The message read, "Did you get the Bitcoin? We are waiting on our end for the transaction." 3 minutes later, a family member received a 9-second call from the same number. Investigators traced that number to Derek Kalila, 42 years old, of Hawthorne, California. He was arrested on February 5. He admitted to sending the messages. His explanation was that he had been watching television coverage of the case and wanted to see if the family would respond. He obtained the family member's contact information from a website. Kalila's arrest on federal charges, including transmitting a demand for ransom in interstate commerce and using telecommunications to harass with anonymous intent, served multiple investigative purposes simultaneously. It removed a fraudulent communication from the investigative landscape. It demonstrated the speed and effectiveness with which investigators can trace digital communications when they choose to pursue them. And it sent a message, formalized in the Department of Justice statement, that authorities would continue to hold accountable anyone seeking to interfere with federal investigations or exploit a victim family's grief. But Kalila's arrest also highlighted something revealing about the authentic ransom communications that remained unresolved. If one person with absolutely no connection to the crime could identify family members' contact information and send demanding texts within days of national media coverage, how does an investigator distinguish that kind of fraud from legitimate communications generated by actual perpetrators? The answer lies in proof of life. Authentic communications from people who actually held Nancy would include information that only someone with direct access to her could know. Information that Derek Kalila, watching television in Hawthorne, California, could not possibly possess. The absence of that information from any of the ransom communications is itself deeply significant to investigators working to separate noise from signal. By the time investigators had reviewed the 41-minute timeline, the medication abandonment, the security system knowledge, the timing coordination with family travel, and the behavioral anomalies saturating the ransom communications, 3 working theories had taken shape. But before we discuss those theories, there is one more piece of evidence that could ultimately resolve this entire case. DNA. On February 13, 2026, the Pima County Sheriff's Department released an official statement that shifted the investigation's trajectory once again. DNA other than Nancy Guthrie and those in close contact to her has been collected from the property. Investigators are working to identify who it belongs to. We are not disclosing where that DNA was located. That final sentence. The deliberate withholding of the location where unknown DNA was found inside the property. That itself is deeply informative. Investigators do not withhold the location of evidence from public disclosure unless the location carries investigative significance that could compromise ongoing work, alert suspects, or contaminate the analytical process of identification. The location where unknown DNA was found inside Nancy Guthrie's home is information that the Pima County Sheriff's Department and the FBI specifically chose to protect. That protection is intentional. It is strategic. And it suggests the location reveals something about how the crime unfolded that investigators are not yet ready for the public, or the perpetrators, to understand. Unknown DNA inside a crime scene from someone who is not Nancy and not among those with legitimate regular access to the property. Collected and submitted for identification. This is the category of evidence that, when it returns a match through the FBI's combined DNA index system, can transform an investigation from theory to certainty in the span of a single laboratory result. The decision to involve homicide investigators from the beginning ensured that all DNA evidence was collected with the chain of custody standards that criminal prosecution demands. Nothing was contaminated. Nothing was mishandled. Every sample was documented according to protocols designed to survive the most rigorous legal challenge. When this case reaches the courtroom, and it is clearly being built toward one, the DNA evidence will be unassailable. But DNA identification is not limited to matching against existing databases. Modern forensic science has evolved dramatically. Forensic genealogy, the same technology that identified the Golden State Killer, that helped solve the Idaho student murders, that has cracked dozens of cold cases across the country, can now work backward through generations of family history to identify a specific person from their biological relatives. Even if the DNA profile does not match anyone currently in law enforcement databases, it can still lead investigators directly to the person who left it behind. The technology exists. The capability exists. The sample apparently exists. The question is only what it will reveal when the analysis is complete. Sheriff Nanos made the decision to call in homicide detectives within the first 24 hours of this investigation. That decision was not made lightly. It was not made on instinct alone. It was made because the evidence he reviewed, the 41 minutes, the medications, the security knowledge, the timing, pointed in a direction that demanded the highest level of forensic standards from the very first moment of the investigation. And now that DNA evidence, collected according to those exacting standards, is being analyzed by some of the most sophisticated forensic laboratories in the country. When it returns a result, everything could change overnight. On the evening of February 13, 2026, the investigation took a significant and visible turn. Fox News, citing a local law enforcement source, reported that 3 individuals were detained in connection with the Nancy Guthrie investigation. The source described the detained individuals as 2 males and one of their mothers. The source indicated a warrant had been served and noted that during warrant execution, technically everyone present is detained. The Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed law enforcement activity near Orange Grove Road and North First Avenue, approximately 2 miles from Nancy's home. Multiple agencies were present. Reporter Shay Mine, who was among the first journalists at the scene, documented vehicles from the Pima County Sheriff's Department, the FBI, Marana Police Department, Oro Valley Police Department, and Sahuarita Police Department, all visible at the location simultaneously. A silver Range Rover was photographed being searched in the parking lot of a Culver's restaurant near First Avenue and River Road. CNN producers on the ground documented investigators photographing the vehicle's interior and trunk before it was towed from the location. The Pima County Sheriff's Department stated that at the request of the FBI, no additional information about the operation would be released at that time. That specific language, attributing the information hold to FBI request, indicates that the February 13 operations were part of a coordinated federal strategy rather than local law enforcement acting independently. Law enforcement activity at the location lasted approximately 4 hours before the area reopened and investigators departed. Consider what this operation represents in its totality. A warrant was served. That means a judge reviewed an affidavit presented by investigators and determined that probable cause existed to believe evidence of a crime would be found at that specific location. Judges do not sign warrants on speculation or theory. They sign warrants when the evidence presented meets a defined legal threshold. The standard is not suspicion. The standard is probable cause, and a judge found it met. Multiple agencies coordinated this operation. The FBI. The Pima County Sheriff's Department. 3 separate municipal police departments. That level of coordination does not materialize for routine follow-up inquiries. It happens when an investigation has developed specific, actionable intelligence that requires immediate and overwhelming response. 3 individuals were detained and questioned. A vehicle was searched and towed. The silver Range Rover became a specific focus of forensic examination that could not be completed at the scene. Vehicles contain evidence. DNA. Fingerprints. Trace materials. Digital records from onboard navigation systems. Cell phone data that persists even after deletion. The decision to tow the vehicle rather than simply search it on scene indicates investigators believed it required the kind of comprehensive forensic analysis that only a controlled laboratory environment can provide. No arrests were announced as of February 14, 2026. No identities of the detained individuals were publicly released. But the operational activity of February 13, the scale of the multi-agency response, the specific location 2 miles from Nancy's home, the warrant that required probable cause before a judge would authorize it, represents the most significant visible investigative movement in this case since the surveillance footage was first recovered and analyzed. Something in the accumulated body of evidence pointed investigators to that specific location, to that specific vehicle, to those specific individuals. And when law enforcement moves with that level of coordination, certainty, and force, it means the investigation has advanced beyond theory into decisive action based on specific evidence that has met the legal threshold required for judicial authorization. Step back from the February 13 operations for a moment and consider the physical forensic evidence that helped build the case to that point. The FBI's Video Forensic Analysis Unit erected a white forensic tent outside Nancy's home on February 12. Specialists who had worked other major cases, including the Brian Kohberger investigation, were on site. An osteometric board was brought in. Investigators recreated nighttime conditions to match those present on the morning of February 1. They were not merely reviewing footage. They were conducting precision forensic analysis with specialized equipment designed to extract every possible detail from the surveillance video that survived the camera disruption. The result of that work was a physical description the FBI published officially on February 12. A male suspect, approximately 5 feet 9 inches to 5 feet 10 inches tall, average build, carrying a black 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack. That specific backpack has become one of the most closely analyzed items in this investigation. Former FBI Executive Assistant Director Joshua Skule analyzed the methodology for CNN and described the height determination as extremely accurate. This is not an estimate. It is a forensic measurement derived from specialized analysis conducted at the actual location by a unit with calibrated instruments and documented precision. The backpack itself, the Ozark Trail hiker pack confirmed as black and 25 liters by the FBI's official description, is exclusively sold through Walmart. Every backpack sold at Walmart creates a potential transaction record. Credit card purchases. Loyalty account data. In-store security footage. If this backpack was purchased at Walmart, and most Ozark Trail products are, the pathway from product to purchaser may exist in retail data that investigators with appropriate legal process can access and trace. Gloves have also been recovered during the investigation. The Pima County Sheriff's Department clarified that gloves were found approximately 2 miles from the home. The gloves visible in the surveillance footage, the vinyl or heavy-duty rubber type designed to prevent fingerprint transfer, are precisely the kind of evidence that yields DNA from its interior surface. When a person wears gloves during physically demanding activity, the interior collects biological material with remarkable consistency. Sweat. Skin cells. The very DNA that the gloves were specifically worn to prevent leaving at the crime scene is instead concentrated on the interior surface that was in direct contact with the wearer's hands throughout the operation. Those gloves are now in forensic analysis. The results are not yet public. But the science is well established, and it is working. There is also second footage. Video captured at approximately 10:52 a.m. on February 1, roughly 4 miles from Nancy's home, showing a person wearing and carrying backpacks at a time investigators have established as critical to the sequence of events. Law enforcement sources indicated the FBI is specifically focused on that individual. That video, combined with the doorbell footage from Nancy's home, establishes a movement pattern that investigators can trace through the network of private cameras that now blanket residential neighborhoods. The expanded request for a full month of neighborhood footage, from January 1 through February 2, is building the documentary record that may capture every appearance of that individual in the area, including appearances well before February 1 that would demonstrate prior surveillance and preparation. When forensic analysis meets comprehensive surveillance documentation gathered from dozens of independent private cameras, the investigative net tightens dramatically and the timeline fills in with a precision that becomes very difficult to challenge. By the time investigators had assembled all of this evidence, 3 working theories had crystallized. Each is supported by different aspects of what was found. None has been confirmed as definitive, but understanding these frameworks reveals why the investigation moved in the direction it did and why the evidence patterns matter so profoundly to how this case ultimately resolves. The first theory posits a kidnapping that went wrong. Someone identified Nancy Guthrie as a target for financial gain. The knowledge of Savannah's prominence, her television platform, her public visibility suggested to a criminal mind that the family possessed resources worth targeting. They planned the operation with enough care to disable the security cameras, to time the approach for pre-dawn hours, to bring equipment including the Black Ozark Trail backpack documented in the surveillance footage. But they underestimated the complexity of what successful abduction actually requires. When complications arose, when law enforcement response proved more sophisticated than anticipated, when the ransom negotiation process became more difficult than their planning accounted for, the operation began to deteriorate. This theory explains the initial ransom demands and the early communication patterns. It accounts for mistakes that more experienced operators would avoid. But it struggles with evidence that contradicts it at a fundamental level. The 41 minutes of confident presence inside the residence contradicts the operational inexperience that would explain the communication failures. The security system knowledge demonstrates a sophistication that coexists uncomfortably with the amateurism of the ransom communications. These two things, insider knowledge of the security system and amateur ransom negotiation, point in different directions simultaneously, and that tension is analytically significant. The second theory considers a staged abduction designed to misdirect the investigation. Under this framework, what happened to Nancy Guthrie occurred for personal reasons that had nothing to do with random criminal targeting. The ransom element provided cover, a narrative engineered to point the investigation toward stranger crime, toward external criminal threat, rather than toward the people and relationships closest to Nancy. This theory better explains several of the most troubling evidence patterns. The familiarity with the home demonstrated by 41 minutes of confident presence reflects personal access. The security system knowledge reflects intimate understanding gained through legitimate presence. The timing coordination with family travel reflects insider awareness. The medication abandonment becomes more analytically coherent under this scenario. If long-term survival of the victim was never part of the actual operational objective, the medications become irrelevant to whoever left them behind. The third theory involves insider involvement enabling the operation. Under this framework, someone with direct access to Nancy Guthrie's life, schedules, and personal vulnerabilities either participated directly in what happened or provided essential information to individuals who carried out the physical operation. This involvement does not necessarily implicate close family members. The extended social, professional, and service circles that intersect with any person's life include many individuals who possess varying degrees of knowledge about schedules, security systems, property layouts, and personal circumstances. Information that seems casual and harmless in one context becomes operational intelligence in the hands of someone planning a crime with the precision this one required. All three theories share one element in common. They all require, as an absolute prerequisite, detailed prior knowledge of Nancy Guthrie's home, life, and vulnerabilities. That requirement narrows the investigation in ways that random stranger theories simply cannot accommodate. The evidence does not support the random stranger narrative. The evidence supports the conclusion that someone who knew this home, this woman, and this family's rhythms was involved in what happened on February 1st. The FBI's 24-hour command post in Tucson remains active. Several hundred detectives and agents remain assigned to the case. The reward stands at $100,000 for information leading to Nancy's location or the arrest and conviction of anyone involved in her disappearance. The investigative architecture includes several specific forensic processes still underway simultaneously, each representing an independent pathway to identification. The unknown DNA from the property is being analyzed through comparison against law enforcement databases and potentially through forensic genealogy methods. The capability exists. The technology exists. When this DNA returns a match, the case could transform overnight from active investigation to criminal prosecution with a specific named suspect. The gloves found approximately 2 miles from the home are in analysis for DNA deposited on their interior surfaces during use. Cell tower data from the period surrounding 2 a.m. on February 1st is being analyzed for phone activity that would identify who was in physical proximity to Nancy's home during that critical window. The expanded neighborhood surveillance request spanning January 1st through February 2nd is constructing a comprehensive documentary record from every camera within 2 miles of the home. Each of these parallel forensic processes represents an independent pathway to identification. If any single one returns a match, it creates the convergence that investigators build prosecutable cases from. Multiple independent streams of evidence pointing at the same individual through entirely separate forensic methodologies. That convergence is what transforms a strong investigation into an airtight prosecution. Sheriff Nanos told reporters on February 12 that investigators had developed good leads. Less than 24 hours later, the February 13 operations unfolded. The warrant. The detentions. The vehicle search and seizure. That timing is not coincidental. When law enforcement moves from good leads to coordinated multi-agency warrant execution in under 24 hours, it means something specific occurred in the investigative process. A piece of evidence aligned with a name. A forensic result returned from the laboratory. A tip was verified through independent means. Something concrete enough to present to a judge and establish probable cause sufficient for a signature. The investigation is no longer theoretical. It is no longer merely building its foundation. It is actively pursuing specific individuals based on specific evidence that has met the legal threshold for judicial action. Over 18,000 tips have been processed. Hundreds of investigators remain committed to this case. The forensic work continues. The surveillance analysis continues. The DNA identification continues. And somewhere in that convergence of evidence, Nancy Guthrie's case is moving steadily toward the resolution her family is waiting for. Nancy Long Guthrie was born on January 27, 1942. She raised a family. She built a life in Arizona across 5 decades. She attended game nights and kept Sunday church appointments by video call. She was someone her daughter described as a woman of goodness and light, with grandchildren who crowd around her and cover her with kisses. Someone who knew her home, her schedule, her security system, and her vulnerabilities took her from that home in the pre-dawn hours of February 1st. Someone who spent 41 minutes inside with a confidence and comfort level that strangers simply do not possess. Someone who knew which cameras to disable and where the connections were. Someone who understood the window of vulnerability created by family travel schedules that are not available in any public source. Someone who left behind the medications that only matter if you intend the victim to survive long enough for them to be relevant to the operation. The medications were not taken. And that fact sits at the center of everything investigators know about what this case actually is beneath the surface of what the ransom notes were designed to make it appear to be. Sheriff Chris Nanos knew from the beginning that something was deeply wrong. Not because of instinct alone, but because the evidence pointed in a direction the ransom notes were specifically designed to obscure. And he made the decision, the critical foundational decision, to build this case from day one with homicide prosecution standards. That decision meant every piece of evidence was collected with chain-of-custody documentation that will survive courtroom scrutiny. The DNA was handled properly. The surveillance footage was preserved properly. The digital timestamps were documented properly. Every glove, every fiber, every biological trace was processed according to protocols designed to withstand the most rigorous legal challenge a defense attorney could mount. Because when this case reaches prosecution, and the architecture of this investigation makes clear it is being built toward exactly that moment, the evidence will be unassailable. The unknown DNA from the property. The surveillance footage establishing movement patterns. The gloves that may contain biological material on their interior surfaces. The cell tower data placing phones in specific locations at specific times. The comprehensive neighborhood surveillance documentation spanning a full month. The forensic analysis of the vehicle seized on February 13. All of it converging. All of it building toward the moment when forensic science and investigative determination produce the identification that transforms this case from active investigation to criminal prosecution. After 14 days, Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. Her family deserves answers. The evidence deserves to produce justice. The 41 minutes that Sheriff Nanos recognized as the key to this entire case from the very first hours of his investigation are now part of a comprehensive evidentiary record that includes DNA, surveillance documentation, forensic analysis of physical evidence, and coordinated multi-agency operations that demonstrate how seriously law enforcement is treating every dimension of what happened in the Catalina foothills on February 1, 2026. Every detail presented here is grounded in official law enforcement statements, court documents, and verified reporting from national news organizations. The frameworks examined are the working analytical tools that investigators use to evaluate evidence patterns. The investigation continues. The forensic work continues. The pursuit of justice for Nancy Guthrie continues. And the 41 minutes will not be forgotten.